My name is Elara. For years, I believed in a simple arithmetic of life. Love plus loyalty equals family. I married Daniel because he was steady, because he joked with the same cadence as my father, and because he could fix my sink without complaining. I trusted Clara because she answered every late-night text and brought soup when my throat was sore. From the outside, we were tiny perfection. Christmas stockings matched, plates stacked just so, a Saturday rhythm so reliable I could set my watch by it. Inside, the arithmetic blurred into subtraction. Small things slipped. A laugh that lasted too long between them, the way Daniel's eyes slid when Clara reached for something nearby. I told myself these were coincidences. I told myself I was making mountains out of molehills. But truth has its own gravity, and one small mistake, a laptop left open, a message that wasn't deleted properly, was enough to drop the whole house of cards. I found them in digital print, words they thought would never be read by me. When the first message opened in my hands, I didn't feel dramatic anger. I felt the stunned silence of someone who has watched a map of their life redraw itself in ink they didn't recognize.
The message thread read like a conversation between conspirators. But what hurt most wasn't the words. It was the way their jokes sounded like private languages I'd been fluent in but didn't belong to anymore. He called her son in texts. She left tiny heart emojis that used to be our thing. Their planning was casual, banal. Dinners, excuses, work trips with timestamps that landed like stepping stones across weekends. They never imagined that a marriage built on comfortable gestures could be so delicately rerouted. For an hour, I sat at my kitchen table, pretending the bright lamps were only light and nothing more. I replayed the dinner we had 2 nights before, the small compliment he offered me about my hair, the way I had laughed like a person who still believed in safety. I ached not only because they betrayed me, but because they made me complicit in my own erasure. I had given them enough kindness to hide behind. That realization changed my grief into a cold, steady focus. Anger came later. First, I learned to watch.
Watching is an ugly talent. It turns love into evidence gathering. For days, I did nothing dramatic. I did not shout. I did not break plates. Instead, I became slow and careful. I made a list of dates. I archived messages. I printed receipts and gathered small outrages. A lipstick stain on a coffee cup he could not remember. A hotel confirmation that he tried to call work-related. I learned to be boring and methodical. There is a clarity that comes when you stop letting emotions run wild and let logic build scaffolding. In that clarity, I mapped the pattern. Secret lunches, a borrowed key, late-night drives that dragged into sunrise. Clara's innocent-sounding messages turned into a narrative about intentional choice. My hands trembled the night I made a folder titled Truth and slid it into a locked drawer. It felt absurd to translate heartache into paperwork, but the absurdity saved me from humiliation. If I was going to be delivered through suffering, I would at least be the author of the chapter where I stopped being naive. People imagine that betrayal is a singular explosion, one scream, one confrontation, an immediate unraveling. For me, it was an archaeological dig. I found bones and artifacts of a life I once loved, and I cataloged them precisely. I emailed myself copies, backed them up in 3 places, and wrote a timeline that felt unpleasantly like a legal brief. Every emotive sentence I had once used forgive became a line item. Date, behavior, evidence. Doing that hurt in a sensible, surgical way. Every collected screenshot, every voicemail I saved, was an incision into the pretend stability. At night, when I couldn't sleep, I whispered the dates into a voice memo so my voice could bear witness.
It felt like I was both witnessing and prosecuting the person who had once warmed me. That is the cruelty of betrayal. It asks you to be two people at once, the one who mourns and the one who prepares. I would be both. I decided then that revenge would be cold. If they wanted to play a slow, quiet game of theft, I would answer with a slow, quieter plan. The plan did not start as malice. It started as a question. What would make their false narrative implode? I considered shouting the truth in the middle of a party, burning bridges publicly, but that felt cheap, a spectacle that would wet my throat and leave a stain of regret. Instead, I wanted a ruin that would be undeniable and quiet, something that would pivot the social axis they spun on. They had built a bubble. Mutual friends, shared vacations, polite nods at neighborhood barbecues. That bubble's currency was reputation, the small ledger of how others perceived them. I realized that to dismantle them, I didn't need to smash. I needed to correct the record. Evidence, context, witness testimony. So I began to think like a strategist. Each move was calculated. Who would receive this information, in which order, at what time, and with what corroborating fact? There would be no revenge that let them wiggle inside uncertainty. I wanted certainty, the kind that eliminates excuses.
First, I tightened the evidence. I arranged for a private copy of Clara's work calendar from a mutual contact who owed me a favor from years ago. I spoke to a bartender who remembered Daniel and Clara laughing at the corner table at 1:32 a.m. and had taken their photo with the band. I dug into metadata, hotel timestamps, rideshare receipts, emails with suspicious subject lines. I did not do this in a rage. I did it with a steady hand. When you want the truth to look ordinary, you gather ordinary things. An ordinary receipt refuses to be dismissed as drama. An ordinary message with a timestamp refuses to be gaslit away. While I was collecting, I practiced lines. I wrote statements I would use. I rehearsed the calmness I intended to display. There is a particular power in being composed when you could very well be torn apart. It makes the other person's deception look exactly like what it is, a choice, not a mistake.
At the same time, I mended myself in private. People assume revenge seekers are hollow. They imagine only rage. That's not true. To disassemble a life that hurt you, you must be resilient. I started therapy again, and I took up running at dawn. My skin cleared. My voice remembered its shape. I stopped apologizing for being angry. I started to sleep without the heavy blanket of fear. Some nights, Clara's laugh still turned up in the piano bars of my memory. Other nights, I sat with friends and looked at their faces, as if cataloging who I wanted near me in the future. Strength does not arrive as a roar. It arrives as consistent small acts. Picking up a phone call from a banker about refinancing, reading novels until midnight, turning down invitations to gossip circles. I learned to enjoy the hum of life without needing it to finish a sentence about me. That was part of the punishment, too. I would rebuild quietly and make my life heavy with purpose. The first person I approached was not Daniel or Clara. It was my sister, Mara, who owns a small but dignified legal office downtown. I knew nothing about law, but I knew people respond to it. I asked her hypothetically, in a way that felt safe, what happens when someone's private betrayal affects shared assets, custody considerations, or social obligations? She listened to me while I framed everything as concern for my own mental health, and later she sent an email back that said simply, "Gather everything, don't post anything, we will walk through options." Her reply was a pivot point because it transformed my plan from angry theatrics into enforceable, accountable action. I rewarded myself with the kind of modest, civilized things that felt like mercy. A haircut, a new kettle, a train ticket to nowhere.
When you are plotting a quiet dismantling, you must also give yourself small mercies to stay human.
I spent weeks building a bedrock of witnesses. I spoke to the dog walker, who had seen Clara and Daniel exit a hotel separately but enter it together. I spoke to a neighbor who'd noticed Clara's car in Daniel's driveway at odd hours. I sent messages to my own circle, asking if anyone had seen anything irregular, phrased without accusation, and curated the replies into a dossier. People tend to avoid drama, but they do not avoid facts. When presented with facts, they will choose a side, or at least stop participating in the lie. I gathered these statements and timestamped them like geology samples. I developed a chart that matched sightings with timestamps and receipts. It looked banal and convincing, like a business report, which was exactly what I wanted. After all, the world we live in favors documentation.
Then there was Clara's employer, a small creative agency where image matters. I made contact via an old friend who now worked in HR there. I told him, bluntly, "You should know that one of your senior producers is entangled in something that could be problematic if it becomes public knowledge." He appreciated the heads up, not out of schadenfreude, but because companies fear scandal. He asked me if I had proof. I did not show him everything then, but I offered enough to make him take notice. Timestamps that correlated with work hours, messages that suggested coordination. In return, he agreed to pause significant client-facing assignments for Clara until the matter could be clarified internally. That step was small, but enormous in effect because it made repercussions professional, not just personal. The social bubble that insulated them suddenly had a rupture where reputation and livelihood began to bleed. I was careful to leave no trail of vindictiveness. I was surgical. The difference between revenge and ruin is intention. I did not want to collapse people for my amusement. I wanted to hold them responsible. Responsibility is a public fact, not a private punishment. So I organized the release of information in stages that ensured clarity. First, I sent a precise, unemotional packet of evidence to Daniel's direct supervisor with a note that suggested an internal review, receipts, calendar inconsistencies, and a politely worded request for comment. I didn't call him names. I wrote as if I were a journalist handing over a straightforward tip. The second packet went to Clara's agency with corroborating witness statements. I left context out of both because context invites debate. Facts force pause. Then I sat very still and waited to see if anyone would attempt to gaslight me back into silence. They tried. Of course they tried. News has its own animal defenses. Daniel called me the next morning in a voice so flat it sounded practiced. He asked why I would do this. He said I was hysterical, that I was inventing things to punish them. Clara texted me a string of pleading messages. At first shock, then anger, thrashing accusations designed to make me feel small and guilty. But by the time their social stories activated, the papers I had filed were already in motion. Their supervisors had seen the receipts and the calendars. The agency paused Clara on client work. Daniel's supervisor called him in and asked for explanations. The language of corporate concerns is blunt. It is not interested in personal spins or theatrical denials. When private misdeeds intersect with professional responsibilities, institutions move. Watching their faces contort from contempt to panic was not pleasure. It was confirmation. The world had a way of adjudicating truth when you provided the documentation it required. Word spread in calibrated waves. A mutual friend received a concise email and brought it to her partner, who was a member of the Homeowners Association. Within 48 hours, their social invites dried up. People who had once attended every dinner politely declined. The parents who used to meet us at the school bake sale began to arrange separate carpools.
Small cruelties of exclusion can be brutal in suburban life. Playdates vanish. Casual coffees are not returned. That was the social currency I chose to spend. I did not leak salacious details to the neighborhood. I let etiquette do the job of distancing. When people step away without fanfare, it is the cleanest kind of ruin. There is no spectacle, only absence. Clara posted reassurances at first. Daniel tried to smile in a neighborhood photo and looked hollow. The emptiness around them grew like frost. As the social world tilted, professional consequences followed. Clara's agency required an explanation. She was placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. Daniel faced an HR conversation so direct it felt like a public inventory. Explain these dates. I did not attend the meetings. I watched from the quiet of my apartment with the dossier open and my heart a steady drum. I remember thinking how odd it was to see corporate language, like conflict of interest, breach of trust, applied to a marriage. But business terms are blunt instruments, and I'd fashioned my case in those blunt terms deliberately. When work begins to look unstable, networks fray. And for people whose social life was built around mutual reliability, that was destructive. The hardest part was the family. The first time my mother called, I thought it would be to comfort me. Instead, she asked questions I had not expected. Had I tried talking to Daniel? Had I considered couples therapy? The gentleness in her voice trembled with fear for the family's name. Families hate messy public sentences. They prefer quiet, repairable mistakes. When I had their attention, I told them facts without flavor. Dates, receipts, witness notes. I refused to dramatize. In the end, some relatives sided with me after reviewing the materials I had prepared. Others, who grew up in the same small town as Daniel, found ways to minimize. Family does not always operate on truth as logic. It often operates on loyalty. But the cracks multiplied. The people who had once come to our Sunday dinners were now cautious callers. The house, once convivial, felt like a stage with missing actors. I had not wanted to hurt people I once loved. I wanted to ensure there was consequence. People confuse these things. When the Homeowners Association president said, "We prefer to keep our neighborhood free from scandal," I understood the code. When a client who previously loved Clara's work suggested they move accounts while things settle, I felt the echo of real loss on both sides. Lives are not purely karma machines. They are interlaced with paychecks and letters of recommendation and friendships that take years to cultivate. I watched the professional scaffolding that had upheld Clara and Daniel's social lives begin to collapse with a slow, indifferent grace. In the cafeteria at work, a colleague mentioned them in a way that sounded like a neutral report, which to my ears felt like justice. The world does not need to shriek to punish. It can withdraw its oxygen politely and let the guilty gasp. People asked me if I felt satisfied. The answer was complicated. There is a peculiar emptiness in watching someone lose the things they took for granted. It is not sweet. It is necessary. I had wanted my dignity back, not a public show. But I will not pretend I did not feel a misguided smallness of triumph when an invitation arrived, back with the words, "regretfully decline." The truth I had assembled was a mirror. For some people, it reflected the reality at last. For others, it did not change the color of their affection. And that, too, is a lesson. Truth does not always equal salvation. It does, however, give you a way out of private torture. I could breathe again. For the first time in months, I was not performing stability for fear of being exposed. I could simply exist. Daniel came to me once, after HR, after a meeting with an old supervisor. He wanted to meet in a coffee shop that used to mean something soft to us. He sat, and he did not try to charm me. He looked smaller, as if the comfortable suit he wore had been removed and only a man remained. He tried to explain stress at work, a complicated friendship,
A lapse in judgment. He asked me if I wanted to try couples therapy. He said he was sorry. The words felt thin after months of correspondence and proof. I listened, and I could see how the social consequences were wearing him down. He was frightened, not by moral realization, but by losing what he'd called stability. I had to admit something to him in that cafe, that the betrayal was not simply about sex or illicit dinners. It was about the systematic taking away of my agency. My calm, the plan, had restored some agency to me. That fact mattered more than his apology.
Clara's texts became fewer and colder. At first, she begged me, pleading the rawness of being found out. Then she tried anger, and finally, silence. The agency that had once given her applause whispered to keep a distance. She called my voicemail and left a message that sounded like emptiness. Sometimes I wondered if I had been cruel. People imagine that revenge turns you monstrous, but in reality, it can simply be accurate. I gave nothing to malice. I gave facts. Yet, there were moments I saw the human cost. Clara, sitting in her car, crying while employees walked past, and I could not help but think of the complexity of the human heart. Betrayal is ugly in both its commission and its exposure. But the exposure leveled the playing field. For the first time, they had to contend with public consequence. That was fair. As the weeks became months, their life narrowed. Invitations dwindled, projects evaporated, and they were forced to spend evenings in the same apartment with the same cold dishes and smaller wardrobes of approval. They tried making amends in the smallest ways, posting vague captions about growth on social feeds, attending couples therapy that felt performative and late. I did not gloat, but I did find a certain satisfaction in the fairness of consequences. There is a moral architecture in the world that sometimes aligns with truth, and sometimes it does not. When it does, it is a rare, quiet blessing. I took that blessing and used it to rebuild the part of me that had been invested in them. I started a small freelance project that used to be a hobby, and then a client paid me more than a month's salary. That kind of ordinary victory tastes like human justice to me. Financially, the impact was real. Clara lost a few projects, and the agency eased her out of a client role that had been her bread and butter. Daniel faced a demotion because trust in his judgment at work had frayed. Colleagues who once let jokes slide now watched his actions. It is unnerving to watch how quickly the scaffolds of life that look immovable can be removed when social capital is withdrawn. They called lawyers, but legal fights are expensive and messy. Often they cost more than whatever intangible thing was taken. I didn't seek legal revenge. I sought social and reputational correction. That correction reverberated in ways that were proportional to the harm they had caused, measured, deliberate, and documented. There was blowback. Not everyone supported what I did. Some friends accused me of weaponizing private pain into public ruin. Others said I should have forgiven. People prefer tidy morals. Forgive, forget, move on. But forgiveness is a luxury when the harm is deliberate and ongoing. I am not a monument to vengeance. I am a woman who wanted to keep her dignity and the narrative that had been stolen from her. The critique hurt in odd ways. It made me consider if I had done the hardest thing, the right thing. In the small hours, doubt visited me. Yet each morning I woke, I saw the list of facts I had compiled and the slow, necessary consequences that followed. I remained confident that exposing truth allowed others to step away from false intimacy. That alone felt like justice. After the social storm settled into a quieter drought, I had an unexpected offer. One of the clients who had paused work with Clara's agency reached out to me, not for revenge, but for craft. They had seen some of my small, public writing on a local forum and wanted a piece for an upcoming campaign. It was an odd turn of events. Loss for them, opportunity for me. I accepted. The work required travel. I checked my passport and wondered how long it had been since I had taken myself anywhere without a shared calendar or a shared approval. Packing felt like another small act of independence. In the hotel room that night, I sat on the bed and realized how little I had thought of myself as a resource. My life had been scaffolded on the shoulders of two people I trusted, and when they crumpled, I discovered that I could stand. There is a peculiar freedom in being the person who survives the unkindness of those you loved. It is not exultant. It is practical. I could now make decisions without fearing the social cost that had once bound me. I sold a piece of furniture that reminded me of them and donated the money to a women's shelter. That felt like a ceremony, removing emotional anchors and replacing them with action. My friends who stayed close to me became anchors and not judges. They listened kindly when I spoke of my plans. They celebrated my small wins. I learned that community doesn't always mean crowds. Sometimes community means the one person who brings soup when you call at 2 a.m. and the neighbor who walks your dog when you are traveling. These things rebuilt a new ecosystem around me, and it was steadier for being smaller and honest. Meanwhile, Daniel attempted a few gestures of public contrition, a donation to a local cause, a post about growth. The community had mixed reactions. Some accepted it, others saw it as a performance. That line is always blurred. Real contrition requires internal work that public posts cannot substitute. I had no appetite to arbitrate the sincerity of his gestures. I simply observed the result. Some doors opened slowly, some remained closed. Clara moved away for a while, the sort of quiet exit people take when the lights dim on a room where they once laughed. I did not celebrate her leaving. I accepted it as natural consequence. People leave, and sometimes they return. The important thing was how I would meet my life, whether they returned or not. What surprised me was how much of the final victory was mundane. There was no epic scene where they were publicly humiliated on a radio show. Instead, the victory was a continuity. Clients who wanted to hire me, a neighbor who invited me to a potluck, a quiet Saturday morning in which I did not check the door for an unexpected presence. I began to cook larger meals again, and friends arrived. I slept without imagining betrayal in the corners. The scale of what I had taken back was not scandalous. It was ordinary. Time, peace, the ability to plan for a future that did not include the small betrayals wrapped in kindness. Sometimes, late at night, I think of Clara as a weather event in my life, sudden and violent, leaving a landscape I had to replow. I could write her off as a villain in a morality tale, but that would be dishonest. She was human and fallible. Daniel was human and fallible. Their choices were condemnable, and the consequences followed. My choice was to ensure that consequence was measured and true, not performative, not petty. I wanted them to know the cost of what they had done, and I wanted myself to know that I could build again. That was my cold justice, the quiet return of everything that matters. Today, my life is not a vengeance story. It is a living ledger of reclaimed things. I travel when I want, I take work that honors me, and I sleep without waking to dread. The people who left are gone, and that hole is filled by people who do not take. The house feels like a home, not a stage. If you want to call what I did revenge, then call it that. If you want to call it justice, that is fine too. For me, it was necessary recalibration. I taught myself how to be cold when required and kind when possible. And I am grateful for a strange mercy. The world sometimes corrects itself when you simply provide the facts and refuse to be ashamed. I rose not by shattering them spectacularly, but by dismantling quietly and building again, stronger, steadier, and on purpose.